Can you imagine having to write some of your most brilliant work as part of a high-stakes job interview? Well, that's pretty much the real story of Joseph Haydn, a young composer who had to prove his genius not just to a new boss, but to an entire orchestra he was about to lead.
So how do you make music that was written over 260 years ago feel, well, new and alive? When you see a modern group like this, the Australian Haydn Ensemble, you're really seeing the end of a very long and very interesting story.
In that story, it all starts with something we can all relate to. A whole lot of pressure at a new job. It's a tale of ambition, rivalry, and just some pure creative hustle.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1761. A 29-year-old Joseph Haydn has just landed a huge, career-making job with one of the richest families around, the Esterházys. For a composer like him, this was the big break. This was everything.
But things were a little more fragile than they seemed. See, just a year before, Haydn's boss had gone totally bankrupt, leaving him out of a job. Luckily, a fabulously wealthy nobleman, Prince Paul Anton von Esterházy, had heard one of Haydn's symphonies and was, really impressed. When he found out Haydn was available, he snatched him right up.
But here's the thing. Getting the job was just the first hurdle. As the new Vice-Kapellmeister, that's basically the assistant music director, Haydn was walking into a pretty tricky situation. He had to prove his worth and fast to a court full of established musicians who were probably wondering, who's this new guy?
And his direct boss? A guy named Gregor Werner, the senior Kapellmeister. Werner was in his 70s. He was old school, and he was not a fan. He actually complained to the prince that Haydn was just a Modehansel, which is basically 18th century German for a trendy hipster who's all style and no substance. Ouch.
So Haydn was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, his new boss, the prince, wanted what they called programmatic music, pieces that painted a picture, kind of like Vivaldi's famous Four Seasons. But on the other hand, Haydn desperately needed to prove he wasn't just some fad chaser and win the respect of all the virtuoso musicians he was now supposed to be leading.
So what does he do? He comes up with an absolutely brilliant solution that's going to make everybody happy. He decides to give the prince exactly what he asked for, but he was going to do it on his own terms.
He writes this amazing trilogy of symphonies all about the different times of day. You have Symphony number 6, Le Matin, or Morning, which literally opens with a musical sunrise. Then there's number 7, Le Midi, Noon, which captures that majestic afternoon heat. And it all wraps up with number 8, Le Soir, the evening, which ends with a huge party and even a musical thunderstorm. He totally nailed the picture-painting assignment.
But here's where the real genius comes in. This wasn't just a political move. These symphonies weren't just about sunrises and storms. Haydn wrote these incredibly difficult, really beautiful solos for every single principal player in his new orchestra. The violin, the cello, the flute, even the bassoon and the double bass. It was his way of saying to his new colleagues, hey, I see your talent, I respect it, and I'm going to make you shine. It was the absolute perfect way to get them on his side.
So, Haydn totally aces his symphonic job interview. But then, plot twist. Just a year later, in 1762, Prince Paul Anton dies. His brother, Nicholas, takes over. Now, Nicholas was an even bigger music fan, but he came with a very particular obsession.
Haydn was about to face a brand new creative challenge, and it all centered on his new boss's favorite and pretty unusual instrument. Any guesses what it might have been?
It was this thing, the baritone, an instrument so rare it was already kind of fading into obscurity, even back then. But Prince Nicholas was completely obsessed with it and was determined to learn how to play it.
So what on earth is a baritone? Well, think of it kind of like a viola da gamba, sort of like a cello's cousin. But look closely. Behind the main strings that you play with a bow, there's a whole other set of strings. These could either just vibrate along with the notes being played, or, and this is the wild part, the musician could actually reach around the neck of the instrument and pluck them with their left thumb. It's an unbelievably complex instrument to play.
So, as you can probably imagine, writing music for your boss's new favorite super complicated instrument, that becomes a top priority. But it seems for a little while maybe Haydn was just a little too busy to get around to it.
And I mean, this is incredible. In 1765, he gets a formal written reprimand from the prince. It basically put him on notice, demanding that he apply himself more diligently to composition for the baritone because, as it said, court officials had seen very few so far. This was a direct order.
Get to work.
So how did Haydn respond to getting written up by his boss? He got to work. And I mean he really got to work. Over the next 10 years, between 1765 and 1775, he composed an absolutely astonishing 126 trios for baritone, viola, and cello. To put that in perspective, that's basically a new piece for this obscure instrument every single month for a decade straight. Talk about productivity under pressure.
So this amazing story of job interviews and office politics and these quirky princely passions, it ended up producing some of the most inventive music of the entire 18th century. And the incredible thing is, that legacy is still very much alive today.
If you go back to the Esterhazy court, Haydn was working with a small, really elite orchestra, maybe 14 to 18 players. It was a chamber group where every single musician was a top-tier performer.
And today, groups like the Australian Haydn Ensemble are recreating that exact experience. They perform on instruments from the period, with about the same number of players, bringing audiences right back to the sound that Haydn himself would have known. This isn't some dusty museum piece, it's a living, breathing performance.
And really, the results speak for themselves. The music Haydn wrote just to get by, to survive his job interview and please his demanding bosses, is still bringing people to their feet in places like Carnegie Hall. It just proves that great art, even when it's born from pressure, can be powerful, passionate, and totally timeless. So the next time you hear Haydn, what are you going to think about? The brilliant composer or the ultimate professional?